They thought they could handle this connection the same way they handled every other one. But this time, something inside them is breaking in a way they can't control. If you've been wondering why they're acting different, confused, or distant, it's because this bond is destroying the old version of them right in front of your eyes. What if the very connection they once tried to resist is the exact force dismantling every outdated belief, every emotional wall, every defense mechanism they built to survive a world that taught them to hide, because this connection is not casual, it is not random, it is not fleeting, it is a mirror so intense and so precise that it leaves them with no choice but to confront the parts of themselves they thought were permanent, and whether they admit it out loud or silently wrestle with it in the dark, this connection is breaking their old patterns in ways they never anticipated, because before you, they were comfortable operating on autopilot, repeating cycles of emotional avoidance, choosing partners who required little vulnerability, mistaking intensity for love and distance for safety, convincing themselves that independence meant isolation and strength meant emotional suppression. But then you arrived, and suddenly the patterns that once protected them began to feel like prisons, because your presence does not allow shallow engagement, your energy does not respond to half-hearted effort, and your silence speaks louder than their excuses ever could, so they find themselves reacting differently, feeling more deeply, thinking twice before pulling away, noticing how their usual tactics of detachment no longer bring relief but instead create an ache that lingers, because this connection activates awareness. And awareness is the enemy of unconscious repetition, and every time they try to fall back into old habits like withdrawing when things get too real, deflecting with humor when emotions surface, or creating distance to avoid accountability, something inside them resists, something unsettled, something restless, something that whispers that the old way no longer fits, and that whisper grows louder with every interaction, every memory, every moment of undeniable alignment that proves this bond is not easily replaceable, and so the patterns begin to crack, not all at once, not in dramatic declarations, but in subtle internal shifts where they pause before reacting, where they reflect instead of running, where they feel instead of numbing, and that shift terrifies them because breaking patterns means breaking identity, and identity feels like survival, and survival feels non-negotiable, yet this connection makes the familiar feel insufficient, because when someone truly sees you, truly understands you, truly challenges you without attacking you, it destabilizes the narratives you've told yourself about who you are and what you deserve, and they start to notice how often they chose emotionally unavailable people because it allowed them to stay guarded, how often they sabotaged promising relationships because chaos felt more predictable than peace, how often they mistook comfort zones for compatibility, and now, with you, the comfort zone is gone, replaced with growth. And growth feels like exposure, and exposure feels dangerous, but also strangely liberating, because deep down they know they are evolving, even if they resist it on the surface, and that evolution is dismantling patterns that may have been decades in the making, patterns rooted in childhood experiences where vulnerability was unsafe, patterns shaped by past betrayals that taught them love equals loss, patterns reinforced by cultural expectations that discouraged emotional expression. And this connection presses on every one of those pressure points, not to harm, but to heal, yet healing requires disruption, and disruption feels like chaos before it feels like clarity, so they oscillate between wanting to lean in and wanting to retreat, between craving the depth you offer and fearing the responsibility that depth demands, because once you've tasted a connection that is authentic, you cannot convincingly return to superficial bonds. And that realization alone begins to dismantle their old ways of relating, because now the games feel exhausting, the hot and cold tactics feel immature, the emotional unavailability feels lonely instead of powerful, and they are forced to confront the truth that many of their previous choices were not about love but about avoidance, not about compatibility but about control, and control is the core of many old patterns, the need to predict outcomes, to guard against disappointment, to leave before being left, to detach before being hurt. But this connection challenges control by demanding presence, and presence cannot coexist with manipulation, so the strategies they once relied on start to fail, and failure exposes vulnerability, and vulnerability opens the door to transformation, because when they realize that pushing you away creates more pain than staying present, they begin to question the very foundation of their emotional reflexes, and questioning is the first step toward rewriting, and rewriting means letting go of stories like, "I'm just not good at relationships" or "I always lose interest" or "love never lasts for me," because those stories were shields, and shields are heavy, and this connection makes the weight of those shields impossible to ignore. So slowly, sometimes painfully, they begin to lower them, maybe not completely, maybe not consistently, but enough to feel the difference, enough to notice that when they communicate honestly instead of defensively, something shifts, when they admit fear instead of disguising it as indifference. Something softens, when they stay instead of running, something stabilizes, and these small shifts accumulate into larger transformations, because patterns are not broken in grand gestures but in repeated conscious choices, and this connection keeps presenting opportunities for those choices, over and over again, until the old reflexes lose their grip, and they may not openly credit you for this internal revolution, but internally they know that meeting you marked the beginning of a different chapter, because before you, they could rationalize their behavior as normal, as justified, as unavoidable, but with you, the contrast is too clear, the chemistry too undeniable, the emotional resonance too strong to dismiss, and that contrast highlights every inconsistency in their old patterns, every defense that once made sense but now feels outdated. And that realization can trigger frustration, because growth is uncomfortable, and discomfort often gets projected outward, so at times they may seem distant, confused, even contradictory, but beneath that surface turbulence is a deeper restructuring taking place, a quiet reorganization of beliefs about intimacy, trust, commitment, and self-worth. Because this connection does not simply ask them to love differently, it asks them to see themselves differently, to recognize that they are capable of emotional depth they once avoided, capable of consistency they once doubted, capable of vulnerability they once feared would weaken them, and as those realizations settle in, their tolerance for old dynamics decreases. They find themselves less attracted to drama, less impressed by surface-level charm, less willing to entertain connections that lack substance, because once you experience authenticity, imitation loses its appeal, and that shift is one of the clearest signs that the patterns are breaking, because the standards evolve, the expectations refine, the self-awareness deepens. And even if they temporarily revert to old habits under stress, the difference now is that they notice it, they feel the misalignment, they cannot fully enjoy the avoidance like they once did, and that awareness creates internal tension that pushes them back toward growth, because evolution, once initiated, rarely reverses completely, and this connection was the catalyst, the spark that illuminated blind spots, the mirror that reflected both their light and their shadows, and shadows, when acknowledged, lose their power to unconsciously dictate behavior, so as time moves forward, whether the connection is physically close or temporarily distant, the impact remains, because patterns, once questioned, begin to dissolve, and even if they resist change, the seed has already been planted, and seeds, given enough reflection and enough emotional honesty, eventually grow, and when they look back at who they were before this bond and who they are becoming after it, the difference will be undeniable. Because this connection did not simply enter their life, it disrupted it, refined it, challenged it, and ultimately began to liberate them from cycles they once believed were permanent, and that is the quiet, powerful truth. This connection is breaking their old patterns not by force, not by pressure, but by awakening a level of awareness and emotional depth that makes returning to the past version of themselves impossible, and whether they acknowledge it today or years from now, they will recognize that crossing paths with you marked the moment their evolution truly began, and even if on the surface they appear unchanged, even if their words still carry hesitation and their actions sometimes echo fragments of who they used to be, beneath that exterior something irreversible is unfolding, because once a pattern is exposed it can no longer operate with the same unconscious power, and this connection has illuminated too much for them to comfortably return to who they were. So now every time they attempt to slip back into emotional avoidance it feels heavier than before. Every time they consider entertaining a shallow interaction it feels unfulfilling. Every time they think about suppressing their feelings it feels dishonest, because awareness has replaced ignorance and awareness demands responsibility, and responsibility is the doorway to maturity, and maturity is exactly what this bond is cultivating within them, even if they resist the pace or question the process. Because old patterns were once their armor, and armor feels safe until it becomes suffocating. And you, simply by being authentic, by refusing to engage in emotional games, by maintaining your own growth and boundaries, have made that armor feel unnecessary and uncomfortable at the same time, and that internal conflict creates friction, and friction creates transformation, because they are beginning to recognize that the cycles they repeated were not destiny but defense, not personality but protection. And once they see that, they can no longer blame circumstances or other people for outcomes that were shaped by their own unconscious habits, and this realization can be humbling, even overwhelming, because it forces them to confront how often they settled for connections that required minimal vulnerability, how often they mistook emotional intensity for compatibility, how often they equated unpredictability with passion, and now with you the dynamic is different, steadier, deeper, more transparent. And that steadiness initially feels foreign because chaos was familiar, but familiarity does not equal health, and this connection is teaching them that love does not need to be dramatic to be meaningful, that commitment does not have to feel like confinement, that vulnerability does not automatically lead to betrayal, and those lessons slowly dismantle narratives formed years ago, narratives that shaped how they approached intimacy, trust, and even self-worth, because at the core of many old patterns is a belief about value, about deservingness, about whether they are truly worthy of something stable and profound, and this bond challenges that belief by reflecting back to them qualities they may have undervalued in themselves: emotional depth, loyalty, sensitivity, strength and softness, and when someone mirrors your potential so clearly it becomes difficult to continue playing small, and that is why this connection feels both inspiring and intimidating to them. Because growth requires stepping into a version of themselves that demands accountability, consistency, and emotional presence, and those qualities cannot coexist with avoidance or manipulation. So slowly the impulse to withdraw when things get serious begins to weaken, the reflex to test your feelings begins to fade, the need to maintain control at all costs begins to soften, because they are learning that real connection is not about control but about collaboration, not about dominance but about mutual vulnerability. And this realization shifts how they view relationships entirely, because suddenly, the idea of partnership feels less like a risk and more like an opportunity, less like a threat to independence and more like an expansion of it, and that cognitive shift is monumental, even if it unfolds quietly, because internal revolutions rarely announce themselves loudly, they happen in late-night reflections, in moments of unexpected self-awareness. In the silence after arguments where they recognize their triggers instead of projecting blame, and each time they choose reflection over reaction they weaken an old pattern and strengthen a new one, and this repetition builds a different emotional muscle, one rooted in patience, empathy, and intentionality, and as that muscle develops their tolerance for old behaviors decreases even further, they may find themselves feeling disconnected from environments or friendships that once felt normal, noticing how certain dynamics now feel draining or misaligned. Because growth recalibrates standards, and when your internal world evolves, your external choices must eventually follow, and this connection is acting as the catalyst for that recalibration, because it holds up a vision of what is possible when two people meet without masks, without pretense, without strategic withholding, and once they experience that level of authenticity they cannot unknow it, they cannot fully return to half-hearted exchanges or emotionally distant interactions without feeling the contrast, and contrast breeds clarity, and clarity fuels change. So even if progress appears inconsistent from the outside, internally the blueprint of their relational identity is being rewritten, belief by belief, reaction by reaction, choice by choice, and sometimes they may grieve the old version of themselves because familiarity, even when flawed, feels comfortable. And letting go of comfort can feel like losing a piece of identity, but what they are actually losing are limitations, restrictions, outdated survival strategies that once served a purpose but no longer align with who they are becoming, and this transformation is not solely about how they relate to you, it is about how they relate to themselves, because breaking old patterns requires self-forgiveness, requires acknowledging past mistakes without drowning in guilt, requires understanding that they did the best they could with the awareness they had at the time, and now that awareness has expanded, largely because this connection forced introspection they previously avoided, and introspection is uncomfortable but powerful, because it reveals both wounds and strengths, and in seeing both they begin to integrate rather than suppress, to respond rather than react, to stay present rather than escape, and over time the person they are becoming will feel more aligned, more grounded, more emotionally available, not because someone demanded it, but because this bond awakened the desire to evolve, and desire is far more sustainable than pressure, and that is why the breaking of their old patterns will ultimately be permanent, because it is rooted in internal realization rather than external expectation, and once someone truly understands that love does not require self-abandonment, that intimacy does not equal weakness, that vulnerability can coexist with strength, They cannot unlearn it, and you, through this connection, have become the turning point, the moment that separated who they were from who they are becoming. And even if the journey includes setbacks, even if fear occasionally resurfaces, the trajectory has already shifted, and trajectories, once altered, lead to entirely different destinations. So whether they fully express it now or only comprehend it later, the truth remains steady and undeniable. This connection is not just influencing them. It is reconstructing them from the inside out, dismantling outdated emotional architectures and replacing them with foundations strong enough to sustain the kind of love they once doubted was possible. And as this internal reconstruction continues, something even deeper begins to unfold within them, because breaking old patterns is not just about changing behaviors on the surface. It is about rewiring the emotional instincts that once operated automatically. And that kind of transformation reshapes the way they experience everything, from conflict to affection to silence. Because now when tension arises, they cannot instinctively run without first feeling the weight of what they would lose, and when vulnerability surfaces they cannot dismiss it as weakness without sensing the strength it actually requires, and when distance appears they no longer feel empowered by it the way they once did, because this connection has redefined what power truly means, showing them that emotional courage holds far more strength than emotional detachment ever could, and that realization quietly dismantles the pride they once placed in being unaffected, because being unaffected was never freedom. It was fear disguised as control, and now that disguise is dissolving, layer by layer, memory by memory, trigger by trigger, and with each layer that falls away they are confronted with a version of themselves that is more honest but also more exposed, and exposure can feel terrifying until it begins to feel liberating. Because once you stop pretending not to care, you no longer have to exhaust yourself maintaining that illusion, and that is one of the hidden blessings of this connection. It is exhausting their old defenses until they naturally surrender them, not because they were forced to, but because holding on to them requires more energy than growth does, and as they start to choose growth, even in small quiet ways, their entire relational blueprint shifts. They begin to recognize their triggers instead of blaming circumstances. They begin to communicate discomfort instead of disappearing. They begin to sit with emotions instead of numbing them, and these shifts may seem subtle from the outside, but internally they are monumental, because they represent a departure from survival mode and an entrance into conscious living, and conscious living requires ownership, requires humility, requires the willingness to admit that some of the pain they experienced in the past was perpetuated by their own unresolved wounds. And this level of accountability is not easy, but this connection has made it unavoidable, because you reflect back to them both their light and their shadows with such clarity that denial becomes increasingly impossible. And while at times they may resist that mirror, at times they may project confusion or frustration outward, deep down they know that what they are experiencing is growth, and growth always feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering, because it stretches identity beyond what is familiar. And familiarity is seductive, even when it is unhealthy, but now familiarity no longer satisfies them the way it once did, because this bond has expanded their emotional capacity. It has shown them a depth of intimacy that makes previous experiences feel surface level in comparison, and once depth becomes the standard, superficiality becomes intolerable, and that intolerance is evidence of transformation. Because the old version of them would have accepted breadcrumbs and called it enough, would have tolerated inconsistency and labeled it excitement, would have settled for partial effort and convinced themselves it was all they deserved. but this connection has disrupted that narrative completely, and now when something feels misaligned they cannot ignore it as easily, because their awareness has evolved, and awareness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep, and so even if they attempt to revisit old dynamics out of habit or fear, they quickly feel the emptiness of it, the lack of resonance, the absence of emotional truth, and that emptiness acts as a compass, guiding them back toward authenticity whether they consciously intend to return or not, because authenticity now feels like home in a way avoidance never did, and this is the quiet revolution happening within them. The gradual replacement of fear-based choices with truth-based ones. The slow dismantling of narratives that once defined them, narratives like, "I don't need anyone" or "love always disappoints" or "I'm better off detached," and as those narratives lose their grip, something softer emerges, something braver, something more aligned with who they truly are beneath the layers of conditioning and past hurt, and that emerging self is capable of the kind of connection they once doubted. Capable of consistency without feeling trapped, capable of intimacy without feeling consumed, capable of commitment without feeling controlled, and that capability changes everything, because it shifts love from being a threat to being a possibility, and possibility inspires courage, and courage sustains transformation, and so even if the process unfolds gradually, even if fear resurfaces occasionally, even if progress feels nonlinear, the foundation has already shifted permanently. Because once someone experiences a connection that challenges them to evolve rather than enabling them to remain stagnant, they cannot fully revert to stagnation without feeling the cost, and feeling the cost creates motivation, and motivation fuels change, and this is why this connection is not just breaking their old patterns but rewriting their future ones, because the person they are becoming through this process will approach relationships differently, will value emotional honesty differently, will choose presence over pride more often than not, and whether that evolution unfolds alongside you or as a result of lessons learned through you, the impact remains the same. You were the catalyst, the mirror, the disruption that initiated a deeper awakening within them, and long after the initial turbulence settles they will look back and recognize that this was the turning point, the moment when unconscious repetition gave way to conscious growth, when fear began to loosen its grip, when love stopped being something to escape and started becoming something to build. And in that realization lies the ultimate truth. This connection did not simply touch their heart, it transformed their patterns, reshaped their emotional identity, and set them on a path of evolution that cannot be undone.